Hello, in this video I'm going to talk about carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are one of the four major groups of biological molecules that the human body uses, the others being proteins, nucleic acids, and lipids. And carbohydrates are named for the fact that they do contain carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. Some people will refer to carbohydrates as CHOs for this reason. In terms of their structure, the carbohydrates have both monomer and polymer versions. So monomers are subunits and polymers are composed of multiple subunits. So the monomer for a carbohydrate is called a monosaccharide, whereas a polymer for a carbohydrate is called a polysaccharide. You've probably heard those terms before. In terms of their functions, carbohydrates in the human body primarily function in providing energy. So we consume carbohydrates and we use those for energy. Though some carbohydrates are important for structure in the human body too. Like for example, you've probably heard of the A, B, AB, and O blood types. What really determines those blood types is the presence or absence of certain types of carbohydrates on the surface of a red blood cell. Some examples of carbohydrates that you might be familiar with include glucose and fructose. Those are examples of smaller carbohydrates. A larger carbohydrate, a polymer, a polysaccharide, if you will, would be like starch. You've probably heard of starch. The human body doesn't contain starch unless we've eaten it, but the human body does contain a different polysaccharide called glycogen, which is very important. Glycogen is stored inside of our heart, inside of our skeletal muscles, inside of our liver, and it's our storage form of carbohydrates for energy. So what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about glucose. Glucose is a very important monosaccharide for the human body. It's our main source of energy. So if we look at the very top of the screen here where it says C6H12O6, that's the molecular formula for glucose. It tells us how many carbons and how many hydrogens and how many oxygens are in a glucose molecule. Below that we see a structural formula for glucose, and this happens to be the linear form of glucose, hence the straight line. We don't see that very often in the human body though, because when glucose is in water, which the human body is made of, the glucose tends to kind of turn around and bite itself on its own tail, forming a ring structure. Now if we look at the bottom left of the screen and the top right of the screen, those are both ring structures for glucose. And if you look closely at those two pictures, right, those two glucose structures are almost identical. They all contain the same number of carbons and hydrogens and oxygens, but if you look closely, one of the hydroxyl groups is up and one is down, and that's referring to the hydroxyl group that's attached to the carbon number 1 there. Both of those are glucose. They're just different forms of glucose. One of those the human body can use and the other one it cannot, oddly enough. So those are both glucose, right? And now let's take a look at the top right of the screen. Right? We have what looks like a ring structure there, but doesn't quite look like glucose, right? If you count up the carbons, there's not enough carbons. There's also not enough hydrogens either. Believe it or not, that is glucose, right? That's sort of a shorthand for glucose. So it turns out that in organic chemistry, we're constantly drawing carbons and hydrogens in organic chemistry, because to be organic means to contain carbon and hydrogen. So a lot of times people just start writing in shorthand in organic chemistry, and they assume carbons and they assume hydrogens. So any place where two lines meet, there's a carbon. And if you have a line that's kind of going nowhere town, there's often a hydrogen at the end of that. So upon closer inspection, that is actually glucose. It's really no different than the glucose on the other side of the screen. And then if we look at the bottom right-hand side of the screen, right, talk about lazy, that's how I write my glucose molecules, right? So all of those are examples of ways that we can draw glucose. Right? Now, glucose is a very important monosaccharide, but there are other monosaccharides that we find in the human body. So up top in green we see glucose, but below that is a cousin to glucose, galactose, and the below that is fructose. Over on the side we see ribose and deoxyribose. Ribose and deoxyribose are important for things like DNA and RNA, whereas fructose and galactose are going to be common in our food products. So these are all called monosaccharides because they are single sugar units. Disaccharides do exist. A disaccharide, as you probably guessed, is two sugar units combined. They're not very common in the body, though. Our body doesn't really make them, but they are common in our food, so I did want to mention them. So see if you can match the picture on the left with the appropriate disaccharide structure on the right. So you might have guessed that sucrose is table sugar, which we see at the bottom of the screen. Lactose is the sugar we find in milk products. And then maltose, my favorite, is a sugar that's common in beer products. Now I'd like to talk about polysaccharides. Polysaccharides are the polymers of carbohydrates. And really what they are is a bunch of carbohydrate monomers connected end on end. So a long chain of glucose molecules, for example, would be a polysaccharide. Glycogen is the important polysaccharide in the human body. Your heart cells store glycogen for energy, your skeletal muscle cells store glycogen for energy, and your liver also stores glycogen for energy. But unlike your heart muscle and your skeletal muscle, your liver will break the glycogen down into glucose and release it into the bloodstream for all cells to use. Whereas your cardiac muscle tissue and your skeletal muscle tissue are more selfish. They use their glycogen only for themselves. So glycogen is just a long chain of glucose molecules connected end on end with branches coming off. Other examples of polysaccharides include starch and cellulose, but those are found in our food products and our body doesn't make those. So what we see here in this picture is a close-up view of what a polysaccharide such as glycogen might look like. And here's another idea that gives you kind of a better picture of it, showing you the longer chains of glucose molecules and the way that they branch in a glycogen molecule.